The man known to history as Heinrich Hoffmann was born on the 12th of September 1885 in the town of Fürth, in the Bavaria region of the German Empire, a suburb of the larger city of Nuremberg. His father was Robert Hoffmann, a photographer by trade who came from a family that had engaged in that craft for decades, effectively having been pioneers of professional photography in Bavaria. Heinrich's mother was Maria Hoffmann. Heinrich's youth was primarily spent at Regensburg, where the family moved when he was quite young, while his father acquired the title of court photographer to His Majesty the King of Bavaria. This was an empty title, which Heinrich later learned his father had actually paid money to acquire. Still, it probably sounded prestigious enough that it benefited his photography business. From a young age, it was clear that Heinrich would follow in his father's footsteps. He took his first photograph in 1898, when Colonel William Cody, better known to posterity as Buffalo Bill, brought his Wild West show through southern Germany, having begun regular tours of Europe from the later 1880s onwards. The picture was of Bill himself, with Hoffmann later quipping that his memoir could be entitled From Buffalo Bill to Adolf Hitler. Hoffmann's innate business acumen, even as a child, was on display here. He sold several copies of the photograph, which depicted Cody astride a white horse and lassoing some rope, to some of his school friends. A few years later, he began training in his father's studio, and under his uncle, after whom Heinrich had been named. Hoffmann grew up in the midst of the Second Industrial Revolution, a period of incredible technological and industrial development that occurred between 1870 and 1914. In many ways, the Second Industrial Revolution was far more transformative of Western society than the First Industrial Revolution that ran from about 1770 to 1840. While the earlier version introduced the concept of factories and steam power, followed by railways and steamships, the Second Industrial Revolution led to electrification, the advent of telecommunications through the telephone and telegraph, as well as the mass extension of the railway networks across Europe and the Americas, and machine tooling. Germany, in particular, benefited from the Second Industrial Revolution after the unifying of the country to form the German Empire in 1871. What was especially significant in all of the technological breakthroughs being made every year was the development of photography. Louis Daguerre had built on earlier research to produce the first daguerreotype camera in Paris in the 1830s. The technology was refined and developed very rapidly in the 1840s and 1850s. By the time Hoffmann was born, the use of the new technology for propaganda purposes was well established. Emperor Napoleon III of France, for instance, used photography widely to highlight the building program he had initiated in Paris in the 1850s and 1860s, all while carefully covering up the urban squalor that existed in many parts of the French capital. The use of photography for propaganda purposes would soon spread, and it would be central to Hoffmann's entire life and career. When he was 20 years old, either late in 1905 or early in 1906, Hoffmann left Germany to go and work in a photography studio in England. It was an exciting time to be a professional photographer. 2 years earlier, the Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis, had just released the first color camera that could be mass-produced and easily used, the Autochrome Lumiere. From 1907 onwards, it was introduced widely across the European and American market. Hoffmann liked England and stayed there for several years before returning to his native Bavaria after additional trips to France and Switzerland. Conflicting accounts suggest he was back home in Bavaria and opened his own studio in Munich to produce photo portraits either as early as 1909 or as late as 1911. To supplement his portrait work, he also widened his contacts in Munich and began producing photographs on a freelance basis for several Bavarian newspapers. Not long afterwards, he began to acquire both a substantial reputation as a photographer and some financial security when Enrico Caruso, the superstar Italian tenor and opera performer of the early 20th century, passed through Germany. Caruso was said to have a contract that restricted official photographs being produced while he was on tour. So when Hoffmann managed to get a photo of him, it sold extremely well. Hoffmann received 400 marks for selling the original to a newspaper and another 2,000 marks through sales of reproductions of it. Hoffmann's first encounter with Adolf Hitler possibly occurred in 1914, though neither man was aware of it at the time, while the authenticity of the event has been questioned by many historians. The occasion was the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914. Fairly fittingly, given how the conflict would hang over Europe and the rise of Nazism for decades to come. The war pitted the Entente powers of Britain, France and Russia against the Central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. The Germans had declared war on Russia on the 1st of August, and the following day invaded neutral Luxembourg in preparation for an advance into Belgium and then northeastern France. That same day, huge crowds thronged the Odeonsplatz in Munich, a large open town square. Hoffmann photographed the scene from an upstairs window overlooking the crowd. Many years later, the same photo was used by Nazi propagandists to highlight the presence of a young Adolf Hitler in the crowd. He was an unknown figure at the time, and Hoffmann had unwittingly captured him in the still of the crowd. The image was later magnified and widely disseminated in Nazi Germany to highlight Hitler's perceived patriotism. However, while Hoffmann later maintained the authenticity of the photo, many historians have questioned it, in particular pointing towards Hitler as having his idiosyncratic toothbrush moustache in it, something which he only began wearing several years later. Perhaps tellingly, Hoffmann would often refer to how much money he had made from sales of the photograph in later years. Whatever the truth of the Odeonsplatz photograph, it would not be long before Hoffmann and Hitler's paths passed in a more verifiable manner. Hoffmann's photographic skills ensured that when he was eventually drafted into the German Imperial Army himself, he was assigned to be a press photographer, often charged with producing still images of German soldiers on the front lines. It was his first introduction into the world of state propaganda and the production of photographs to fit with official state narratives. He also worked as an aerial photographer, taking images on reconnaissance missions in the skies over the Western Front. These were significant years in terms of his personal life. In 1911, he had married Theresa Baumann. A daughter, named Henrietta, was born in 1913, followed by a son named Heinrich after his father, in 1916. It was a happy marriage until Theresa died suddenly in 1928. A year later, Heinrich would marry a composer by the name of Erna Grübke. Beyond this, Heinrich's personal life was most notable for his fondness for money and the trappings of wealth, and his alcoholism. Hoffmann was a heavy drinker throughout his adult life, and in later years, his frequent excess became problematic. Some within the Nazi inner circle even referred to him as the court jester on account of his excessive weight, loose tongue, and often inappropriate behavior. With the war over in November 1918 and Germany descending into revolution and internal turmoil, Hoffmann returned to Bavaria. A revolt had shook Berlin in January 1919 as groups there sought to establish a communist government in emulation of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Similar unrest was now spreading across Bavaria, and Munich became the site of street battles between leftist groups and right-wing paramilitary outfits like the Freikorps that the government was using unofficially to try and establish some order across Germany. On the 6th of April 1919, the communists gained the upper hand, and a Bavarian Soviet Republic was declared. It would last for just 4 weeks, leading to intense violence, both as a result of disunity within the ranks of the communists and then a bloody fight for control of Munich in late April and early May. Nor was that the end of the disorder. It dragged on into the second half of 1919 and 1920, with incidents like the Kapp Putsch, an effort to establish a right-wing autocratic government in Bavaria, occurring in March 1920. Hoffmann was an eyewitness to these events and put his cameras to good use, publishing his first book of photos documenting the revolutionary events in 1919. This he entitled 1 Year of Bavarian Revolution in Pictures. The events of 1919 and 1920 were significant in Hoffmann's life beyond leading to his first published book. It was during this time that he first met Adolf Hitler and joined the nascent Nazi movement. The National Socialist German Workers' Party grew out of several right-wing parties that came and went quickly in Bavaria in the 2 years following the end of the First World War. Initially led by Anton Drexler, by the summer of 1921, Hitler would be their leader, though long before that he had established himself as the Nazis' preeminent speaker. Hoffmann was clearly an early witness to the meetings which led to the establishment of the party in Munich in 1920, and its early gatherings. In fact, he joined the party almost immediately, and was recorded as member number 57. Hoffmann would later argue that his early membership was in line with his duties as a photojournalist at the time. He believed that important events were going to occur around Hitler and this new political party, and surmised that the best thing he could do was to join the party himself and get a front-row seat. Yet these pronouncements were made in the midst of his post-war trial and imprisonment, and must be treated with some skepticism. The most likely explanation is that Hoffmann was attracted to the Nazi platform, one which argued that Germany had been betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles that brought the First World War to an end, and that the country was being destroyed by a coalition of conspirators led by the Jewish community and the communists. Try as he later might to suggest that he was simply a journalist reporting on the Nazis, the evidence is clear that Hoffmann was soon acting as Hitler's personal photographer and was named by the Nazi leader as such. He would hold the position for nearly a quarter of a century. This means that if you look at a photo of Adolf Hitler today, one in which he is posing for the camera rather than being captured at a rally or some other public event, it was more than likely taken by Heinrich Hoffmann. One of the reasons why Hoffmann was able to remain in his role for so long was that he developed an ability to portray Hitler in a manner which presented him as a charismatic leader of sorts, despite his decidedly unusual appearance and the fact that Hitler was in many ways the antithesis of the blonde, blue-eyed German that he lionized in his writings and political rhetoric. Soon Hoffmann was present at all important Nazi events. He even took part in the Beer Hall Putsch, the coup whereby the Nazis had attempted to seize power in Munich on the 8th and 9th of November 1923. Hitler fled the city after the chaotic suppression of the insurrection, but was later arrested and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. Many of the photos of the events of the Putsch extant today were taken by Hoffmann. In these early years of the Nazi movement, Hoffmann developed a close friendship with Hitler, and it was this personal relationship that would form the basis of his rise in the years that followed. One of the things which Hitler liked about Hoffmann was his seeming lack of political ambition. With others, Hitler always had to be aware of where they were trying to curry favor with him in their personal dealings, but Hoffmann was always content to simply be the Nazi photographer and no more. He was also loyal. When Hitler was released from Landsberg prison in December 1924, Hoffmann was one of a small number of individuals who showed up to meet him outside. In later years, he dined frequently with Hitler in Munich, and they shared common interests about a wide range of non-political matters. It helped early on that Heinrich's first wife, Therese, got along well with the Nazi leader. It was also Hoffmann who first introduced Hitler to Eva Braun, Hitler's long-term partner from the mid-1930s onwards, who he was briefly married to, before they both took their own lives in 1945. Braun and her sister Gretel worked for a time in Hoffmann's Munich photography studio, and it was through her boss that Eva was introduced to Hitler in 1929. She was only 17 at the time, and the relationship developed gradually in the early 1930s. In its early days, the courtship was facilitated by Hoffmann, with Braun often being invited to the Berghof, Hitler's alpine retreat, along with Hoffmann and his second wife. These years in which Hoffmann's role in Hitler's inner circle expanded, and he introduced him to Eva Braun, also saw the rise to power of the Nazis. This was doubly surprising because it saw the party emerge very swiftly from relative obscurity. As we have seen, Hitler was released early from Landsberg prison in late 1924. Even more surprisingly, the Bavarian authorities quickly allowed him to re-establish the Nazi Party in 1925. Hoffmann was one of its main photographers and propagandists in the years that followed, but the party was insignificant in German electoral politics throughout the second half of the 1920s, after deciding that they would seize power through the ballot box rather than at the end of a rifle. Their success was entirely owing to the economic, social, and political crisis which gripped Germany following the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression in Europe and the Americas. Suddenly, the party's rhetoric of German revival and its simplification of Germany's woes as being entirely owing to groups like the Jewish community and the traitors who had allegedly betrayed Germany at the end of the First World War suddenly gained enormous traction. In 1932, they became the largest party in the German Reichstag. Then, at the end of January 1933, a deal was struck with a coalition of German centrist politicians and business leaders for Hitler to become Chancellor of Germany. Within a few months, the country had been transformed into a one-party state, and an enabling act was passed to allow Hitler and the Nazis to rule by decree. In 1934, Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President to become the Führer, or leader of Germany. Hoffmann played a substantial role in the rise to power of the Nazis, and in particular Hitler as the German Führer. How Hitler styled and presented himself was important. It may surprise many people today, but a great number of ordinary Germans who flocked to the Nazis as both voters and members in 1930, 1931, and 1932 later stated that they did so because of the magnetism of Hitler's rallies and speeches, and how he was portrayed as a potential savior of Germany from the national humiliation and economic devastation that had occurred in the country since the First World War. Hoffmann was central to this propagandist depiction of Hitler. For instance, from the Second Nazi Party rally, provocatively held in 1926 at Weimar, the town where the German Republic had been founded after the collapse of the German Empire in 1918, Hoffmann was responsible for producing photo books of each annual Nazi rally, most of which were held at Nuremberg, and helped to propagandize the party. He also produced the photos for a picture book of Hitler published in 1932 under the title of The Hitler Nobody Knows. It was an effort to portray a highly stylized version of Hitler the man to the German people as a leader in waiting. The introduction was written by Heinrich's son-in-law, Baldur von Schirach, the head of the Nazi youth organizations, who that same year married Hoffmann's daughter Henrietta. Von Schirach's brief text gave an indication of the use to which Hoffmann's photos were put, proclaiming, quote, "Our age will perhaps honor and love this great man, but will not be able to understand his true greatness. It does not need to. We need only look respectfully on the powerful personality of the Führer, and thank God in heaven that he has not left us alone." Hoffmann's photographic work involved a substantial amount of censorship in how Hitler was presented. For instance, Hitler did not allow images of himself to be distributed, which portrayed him in an overly relaxed or informal manner. He was always presented as the man of purpose, acting on behalf of the German people. This meant that photographs of him wearing lederhosen, the short trousers worn particularly in Bavaria and Austria, were not widely distributed, despite Hitler's praising of traditional German garb, and the fact that he was, in fact, captured wearing them in a photo dating to around 1930. Elsewhere, the Führer was critical of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, being photographed swimming or surrounded by women. Yet the most persistent element of the photographic censorship that Hoffmann was ordered to impose was the injunction that Hitler should never be photographed wearing glasses. The Nazi leader had developed problems with his eyesight during the First World War, as he came into contact with mustard gas. His sight declined further over time, and he wore glasses regularly. A sign of the success of the censorship imposed by Hoffmann and others is clear in that very few people know today that Hitler did wear reading glasses, and there are very few extant photographs proving it. These issues of censoring photos of Hitler in order to avoid portraying him in a particular light were not the only difficulties Hoffmann's work involved. Years later, after the war, he reflected on how Hitler could be a difficult subject to photograph. He would not take direction from a photographer on how to pose and set a scene, nor did he allow Hoffmann to be in charge of the settings for photographs. Instead, he would usually receive a call from one of Hitler's secretarial staff telling him where and when to be for a photo shoot. Hoffmann was then expected to drop everything and rush to the site in order to have everything ready for when Hitler arrived, a methodology which must have been hazardous for an individual with a growing alcohol problem as the years went by. Once there, Hoffmann recounted, Hitler would, quote, stride in, take his stance in front of the camera, head stiff, chin drawn in, hand on his hip. Everybody knows the pose. He had only 3 public poses: one hand on one hip, a hand on each hip, and arms folded. Then he would announce, I am ready. Take my photograph. And no photographer would have dared to suggest, my Führer, the public is bored with that pose. Would you be so kind as to try another? Even I never tried to tell him how to pose, of course. But I always had my camera with me, even when I was just paying a social call. I'd watch him till I saw something I liked. Then I'd call out, there, hold it, just like that. Hoffmann's position in what the Nazis proclaimed as the Third Reich, a third German empire after the first medieval German empire, and then the second German empire that had existed between 1871 and 1918, became more official in the mid-1930s. He was recognized as the official photographer of Hitler and also as the senior party photographer in some circles, though this always clashed with the fact that he and Joseph Goebbels did not get along, and Goebbels, as the Nazi Minister for Propaganda, was in charge of how the regime was depicted visually to the German public. Despite this, Hoffmann acquired a growing range of positions which solidified his status in other ways. For instance, in 1933, he was elected to the Reichstag. The German parliament ceased to have anything other than a ceremonial role after the Nazis seized power, and Hoffmann's election to it, as with so many other supporters of the regime, was a kind of patronage from Hitler. Later, Hoffmann would also be given an honorary title of professor, one which was bestowed on numerous cultural figures who supported the regime and were close to the leadership. As well as becoming an important figure within the Third Reich in the 1930s, Hoffmann also became exceedingly wealthy. He had exclusive rights to the sale or reproduction of a great many photos that he took of the Führer, and since many of these images were reused on everything from postcards to postage stamps sold throughout Germany and later occupied Europe, Hoffmann earned huge royalties. All of this was structured through his company, publisher of National Socialist Pictures, a name which suggested it was almost a government institution, but which, in reality, Hoffmann was the sole shareholder of. Hitler also received a slice of the royalties, which he reinvested in cultural programs in the Reich, but Hoffmann largely received the rest. The amount of Reichsmarks involved was substantial in the 1930s, and made him a multi-millionaire in modern terms by the end of the decade. Yet, even this was eclipsed by the eye-watering sums which accrued after the Second World War broke out. People all over the continent used stamps bearing Hitler's image, and whenever they did, a small royalty was paid to Heinrich Hoffmann. Such was his income that if the war had been won by the Germans, Hoffmann would have become a billionaire, adjusting for currency and inflation. Hoffmann's continuing promotion during these years reflected his close relationship with Hitler. Hitler often visited the Hoffmann household in Berlin. It is important to remember that the Nazi dictator had been an unsuccessful artist himself in his youth, and that after becoming leader of Germany, he continued to display a strong interest in art and architecture. In line with this, he surrounded himself with many figures like Hoffmann and the architect Albert Speer, who subsequently became one of the foremost ministers in the German government. When he visited Hoffmann's household, the pair would drink tea into the late hours and converse about photography and art. Hoffmann even tried to convince Hitler to have a drink with him on occasion, but Hitler, who was not a teetotaler but almost never drank alcohol, did not often acquiesce. On one occasion, when he accepted a glass of wine, he complained about how bitter it was and added lumps of sugar to the glass. A good indication of their familiarity with one another is that Hoffmann continued to refer to Hitler as Herr Hitler long after he became ruler of Germany, where nearly everyone else used more formal titles. This irritated many people in the leadership, and the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels once even visited Hoffmann's office and angrily told him that he must begin addressing Hitler as Mein Führer, my leader. Hoffmann later raised the issue with Hitler, who told him to continue addressing him as Herr Hitler. Another sign of Hoffmann's rise in the cultural world of Nazi Germany was the role he played in the first great German art exhibition in Munich in 1937. Hitler wanted a wide-ranging exhibition of artwork that would lionize the story of the German people and modern German history and culture. The first such exhibition, one of 8 held down to 1944, was staged in 1937. Hoffmann was originally drafted in simply as one of the selectors of the artworks, though he later became the critical individual with a virtual veto over what was and wasn't included. Many German artists were scandalized, arguing that while Hoffmann might have been a relatively accomplished photographer, his wider knowledge of German art was mediocre. His elevation and the manner in which it came about points towards his other role during these years in censoring what Hitler designated as degenerate art, art which was deemed to be pornographic or degenerate in portraying a version of German culture or history with which the Nazis did not agree. Hoffmann had himself been drafted into the committee for the first great German art exhibition after the interior decorator and architect Geri Trost was removed from the panel on account of her selection of degenerate art. The campaign against degenerate art childishly included an exhibition in Munich in 1937, the same year the first great German art exhibition was staged in the German House of Art in the same city, in which 650 pieces of modernist art, which the Nazis were critical of, were hung forlornly next to graffitied walls and installations mocking the works in question. Hoffmann was also sent as part of numerous diplomatic missions to various parts of Europe during the mid to late 1930s, often ones which did not involve Hitler, yet for which an official photographer was considered necessary. One that did involve Hitler was a state visit to Mussolini's Italy in May 1938, as the leaders of the two largest fascist states in Europe grew closer to one another. This resulted in another photo book by Hoffmann entitled Hitler in Italy, one of a series of such travel books concerning the Führer in the 1930s, bearing titles like Hitler in Bohemia and Hitler in his mountains. A trip Hoffmann did not accompany Hitler on, but instead accompanied the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and a team of diplomats, was an embassy to the Soviet Union in 1939. A peculiar story has attached itself to the trip. It is claimed that Hoffmann was sent along with von Ribbentrop, who was negotiating a non-aggression pact with his Soviet counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, at the time in advance of the outbreak of the Second World War, in order to try and clandestinely take some close-up photographs of the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Hitler allegedly wanted these in order to try and determine if rumors that Stalin had some Jewish ancestry, as was believed in some Nazi circles at the time, were true. The incident points towards the peculiar behavior which the anti-Semitism of the Nazis could incite. When interviewed in prison in later life after the Second World War, Hoffmann provided his own reflections on the trip to Russia. During this, he retrieved a photograph from his wallet of Stalin next to Hoffmann at a banquet in Moscow, which had evidently been taken by Hoffmann's assistant photographer. It had a curious contradiction to it. On the one hand, Stalin was, Hoffmann explained, cheerily offering a toast to Hitler by hoisting a glass, while with his other hand he was ushering another German photographer away from him. The image clearly demonstrated the way that dictators like Stalin in the interwar era carefully choreographed photo opportunities. Hoffmann explained that he had shown the picture to Stalin afterwards and offered to destroy it, but that the Russian leader had told him to keep it. Hoffmann then went on to explain that his broader mission to the USSR had been to try and get a sense of Stalin and his motives, and then report back to Hitler, the Führer believing that von Ribbentrop and the staff he had appointed in the Foreign Office were incompetent and incapable of producing decent intelligence of this kind. Perhaps the story is an indication of the trust Hitler placed in Hoffmann, or perhaps it is a sign of some level of delusion in Hoffmann about his place at the Führer's court. Hoffmann photographed Hitler in one of his most famous images in March 1938. By then, Germany was well on the way to inciting a new war in Europe. The German army had been rebuilt. An air force, the Luftwaffe, had emerged in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler's rhetoric of reclaiming lands lost after the First World War and creating a greater Germany was being ramped up. In March 1938, this resulted in the German annexation of Austria, after years of political pressure for the Union, or Anschluss. Hoffmann was unexpectedly invited to go on a drive by Hitler in the midst of it. He had no idea where they were going, only that Hitler ordered him to bring a change of clothes with him, stating that they might be away for several days. After leaving Berlin, they drove all the way to Munich, before heading even further south into Bavaria, to the town of Simbach, on the Austrian border. Once there, Hitler told Hoffmann that he had a great desire to visit the town of Braunau am Inn, in Austria, where Hitler hailed from. When Hoffmann stated that that would mean crossing into Austria, with which Germany was embroiled in a diplomatic crisis, the Führer smiled and told the driver to continue on. As they proceeded, they passed soldiers along the way, with Hoffmann only then realizing that the Anschluss was underway and German troops were moving into Austria. They then arrived at Braunau, where Hoffmann photographed Hitler with the spire of the town clock tower in the background. The image was used a year later on a German postage stamp that was issued to mark the 50th birthday of Hitler on the 20th of April 1939. The Anschluss was just the beginning of the Nazi conquest of most of continental Europe. In the autumn of 1938, the Sudetenland was acquired from Czechoslovakia through diplomatic pressure, and in March 1939, the rest of the country was occupied. The Second World War began when the Nazis invaded Poland at the beginning of September 1939. It, too, was quickly vanquished. Then, in April 1940, a series of rapid campaigns brought Denmark and Norway under German rule, followed by the Low Countries and France that summer. With the Third Reich now extending from western France to eastern Poland, it now covered most of the parts of Europe, barring Italy, that had produced some of the finest artistic work and collections ever produced in the continent. For instance, the Louvre Museum was in Paris, while the Low Countries had been home to both the Burgundian Renaissance of the 15th century and the Dutch Golden Age of the 17th century. Many people in these countries had private collections that were soon going to be ransacked by the Nazis, particularly so where they were in Jewish hands, given the Nazi policies towards the Jewish people of Europe. Some collections would only avoid desecration because of preventative measures. A little-known fact is that the French had taken preventative measures to preserve the collections in the Louvre, in anticipation of German bombing campaigns against Paris or occupation of the city, and many of the museum's most iconic paintings and statues had been moved to remote parts of France in 1939. As the war went on, and the Nazis occupied more and more parts of Europe, they began systematically plundering the continent. This was typical for war at the time. The Louvre Museum's collections were, in many ways, built on Napoleon Bonaparte's plundering of Italy and its Renaissance and Baroque masterpieces during his Italian campaigns of the 1790s. In the case of the Nazis, many of the highest-ranking members of the regime considered themselves to be connoisseurs of fine art and were determined to amass private collections of some of the great works of art produced in Europe over the centuries. Indeed, this organized theft of artworks had commenced as early as 1933, when the Nazis began taking any works which could be found in the possession of Germany's Jewish people. This process expanded following the occupation of Poland, Denmark, the Netherlands and France, each of which had major museums and art galleries. For instance, Raphael's Portrait of a Young Man and Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine was stolen by the governor of occupied Poland, Hans Frank, and kept in his private residences during the war. The head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor for most of the war, Hermann Göring, stole numerous paintings by Vincent van Gogh and Diego Velázquez, amongst many others, for his private collection. Countless other paintings had mysterious journeys in Germany during the war before being found in the 1940s, 1950s, or even in more recent times. It is estimated that 650,000 artworks and cultural objects, some obviously more valuable and culturally revered than others, were stolen as part of the Nazi plundering of the continent between 1933 and 1945. Hoffmann was one of the more prominent individuals involved in assembling his own private art collection out of looted Nazi paintings. Even during the war, this was something of a clandestine operation. Hitler was anxious that the scale of the illegal looting would be limited, and that paintings taken from the occupied territories would be sent to Germany for display in museums and galleries run by the Nazis there. A market, though, developed for paintings amongst the Nazi elite and other wealthy Germans, and the Nazi leader was too preoccupied with the war to put a stop to it. Hoffmann was just one of numerous people who entered bidding wars for paintings acquired by agents, primarily in the Netherlands and France, though others, like Göring, were in a position to simply have military units under their command physically acquire paintings for them and bring them back to Germany on his behalf. In all, Hoffmann is understood to have acquired somewhere in the region of around 278 paintings. He had a particular interest in the works of the masters of the Dutch Golden Age of the 17th century, when the painters of the Netherlands were considered the finest artists in the world. As we will see, after the war, these paintings would have their own unusual story. Throughout these early years of the war, Hoffmann attended regular tea parties with Hitler in Berlin. This was in the first 2 years of the war, while the Führer was still largely residing in Berlin. He would later make his base in the Wolf's Lair bunker in Prussia, after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. These gatherings would usually commence at about 1 a.m. in the morning, Hitler being somebody who worked late into the night and often did not rise until nearly midday. They were seemingly frustrating events for those like Hoffmann who were called to attend them. Hitler had pent-up energies from the day, perhaps increasingly from the amphetamines and other drugs he was taking to keep his energy levels high. As such, he needed to rant effectively. Often those in attendance, such as Hitler's secretaries and his doctors or other staff, would listen to the Führer talk about a range of fairly superficial and non-political topics. For instance, Hoffmann later recollected the Führer's fondness for discoursing on train accidents in German history, of which he seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge, listing dates of crashes, the number of fatalities, and the speed the trains had been travelling. Attendees would sit, appearing to listen intently, whilst secretly struggling to stay awake. Hoffmann may have been more interested when talk turned to architecture and the opera. These nighttime tea parties took on a strange hue in 1944 and 1945, as they were punctuated by air raid sirens and explosions from Allied bombings. As much as Hoffmann might have been able to reminisce about his late-night tea parties with Hitler's inner circle, the reality was that during the course of the Second World War, his relationship with the Nazi leader became more and more strained. Hoffmann's excessive drinking had become problematic, and this happened at a time when Hitler was also becoming irritable in general. The war had turned against Germany from the winter of 1941 onwards, after the Nazis failed to conquer the Soviet Union in a short campaign, and the United States then entered the war to form a grand alliance with Britain and the USSR. This led the Führer to strike out at others for real or perceived failings. By 1943 and 1944, nobody was secure in their positions, as the German defeat looked more and more inevitable. In Hoffmann's case, his alienation from Hitler was fueled as well by others within the dictator's circle. In particular, his private secretary Martin Bormann, and his personal physician Dr. Theodor Morell, the latter of whom Hoffmann had first introduced to Hitler to help him treat an eczema problem, worked against Hoffmann's presence at either the Wolf's Lair or the Reich Chancellery bunker from 1943 onwards, eventually concocting a story that Hoffmann was suffering from parathyroid B, and that it was a contagious condition, something which led Hitler, whose health was increasingly precarious in a great many different ways, to banish Hoffmann from visiting him. In any event, by then Hitler was such a broken individual, his health failing, prematurely aged, and with a permanent stoop, that Hoffmann's photographic skills were scarcely needed. There were few new photos to be taken to try and lionize the defeated Führer. Old photos from a time before the Nazi defeat had become inevitable were largely reused. Hoffmann's estrangement from Hitler was further exacerbated during these years by an incident involving the photographer's daughter. Henrietta Hoffmann had married Baldur von Schirach in 1932, a figure who rose from being a leader of the Nazi youth programs in the 1930s to become a Gauleiter, or regional administrator in Vienna, eventually playing a major role in the Holocaust of that city's substantial Jewish community. Her marriage aside, on a visit to the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat, on the 24th of June 1943, Henrietta had, in the presence of her father, husband and others such as Goebbels, who later recounted the event in his diary, confronted Hitler about the treatment of the Jews of the Netherlands. She had recently been there, and had been offered the goods of a Jewish Dutch family for a small price by an SS officer who had confiscated them in the process of ordering them onto trains to be sent to the death camps to the east. Different accounts of Hitler's reaction have been produced. One has him curtly responding by simply saying to her, quote, "You are sentimental," while others describe Hitler as flying into a rage about her questioning of Nazi Jewish policy. Whichever is true, what is clear is that Henrietta and her husband were never again invited to the Berghof, a place which she had visited frequently since her childhood in the 1920s. The incident cannot but have damaged her father Heinrich's relationship with Hitler. Hoffmann's own views on the Jewish community and the Nazis' increasingly brutal series of policies through the 1930s and into the 1940s are largely unclear. He reached the position that he did within the Third Reich largely by being extremely apolitical, rarely expressing views on any political matters. We can probably fairly assume that he was anti-Semitic, based on the general prevalence of anti-Semitic sentiment in Germany in the interwar period and the very act of his joining the Nazis so early on in their history. He did, however, suggest after the war that he had tried to protect a number of Jewish people from the final solution, whereby the continent's Jews were deported to Poland and mass murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau and the other death camps. For instance, he claimed he had helped a young Jewish artist by the name of Feuerler, who had been detained and was due to be transported eastwards. Hoffmann claimed that he had deceived Hitler by petitioning him to intercede in the case by showing him a portfolio of the young man's artwork and claiming that he had been arrested for anti-war protests without mentioning that he was Jewish. Hoffmann stated that this was one of many instances in which he intervened to save the lives of Jewish people during the war. Yet this hardly excuses Hoffmann's conduct. Someone who acted as one of the chief propagandists for the leader of a genocidal regime for a quarter of a century hardly earns a reprieve based on one or two moral interventions. Hoffmann tried to see Hitler again before the Second World War ended, following his ostracizing in 1944. Early in 1945, he visited a doctor in Vienna where he obtained a letter saying that Bormann and Morell's claims that he was suffering from some kind of contagious thyroid disorder were false. With this, he headed for Berlin, where Hitler was overseeing the final desperate defense of what remained of the Third Reich as the Soviets entered eastern Germany and the Western Allies fanned out across the Rhineland. The visit was in vain. Although he gained entry into the bunker in the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin to see Hitler, as soon as he entered his office, Hitler drew away from him with a startled expression, claiming that Hoffmann would infect him if he came any nearer. Hoffmann tried to explain to him that this was not true, but the Nazi leader would not listen. Hoffmann was one of the first after the war to reflect on how the doctor that he himself had introduced Hitler to, Theodor Morell, had essentially begun to fuel Hitler with a cocktail of drugs as the war went on, ones which, combined with his actual health problems, had left the Führer as a frail, ill man, impervious to reason when he visited him in the bunker in 1945. As is well known, Hitler took his own life in the Reich Chancellery bunker on the 30th of April 1945, alongside Eva Braun, who he had married hours beforehand, and 16 years after Hoffmann had first introduced her to him. The war dragged on for just over another week as Hitler's designated successor, one of Hoffmann's nemeses, Joseph Goebbels, also took his own life a day later, and then the new leader of the Third Reich, Karl Dönitz, absconded to Flensburg, near the Danish border, to organize the surrender of what remained of the Nazi regime to the Western Allies. Just days later, on the 10th of May, Hoffmann was arrested by US troops. there was little or no evidence to try him on the basis of war crimes or having an official position within the Nazi government, but Allied prosecutors were anxious to convict an individual who had been so close to Hitler on a serious crime. In the end, they settled on a charge of war profiteering, an apt one given that in trying to decipher Hoffmann's motivations over the years, it appears that money and social recognition seem to have been his primary desires. He was convicted early in 1947 and sentenced to 10 years in prison, while his ill-gotten wealth and art collection were all confiscated. Hoffmann would ultimately never serve the 10-year sentence that was handed down in 1947. No sooner had the war ended than the Western Allies and Soviet Union had commenced a new conflict with one another. Germany, divided between a US-backed West Germany and a communist East Germany that was a de facto satellite of Moscow, was at the very coalface of the new Cold War, and the treatment of former Nazis softened in the late 1940s. Many former German military commanders during the war, for instance, had their sentences reduced significantly and were released in the early 1950s and drafted into the Federal Border Protection Force of West Germany, what would subsequently become the Bundeswehr in 1955. In such an environment, Hoffmann's sentence was appealed and reduced to a 4-year term. He was released on the basis of time served prior to his conviction at the end of May 1950. More striking and controversial still was that some of his wealth and looted artworks were returned to him by the Bavarian provincial government on petition not long afterwards. It was a much-changed Hoffmann who left prison. Deprived of access to large quantities of alcohol while incarcerated, he had lost a huge amount of weight, and photos attest to his extremely different physique in 1950 from what it had been back in the 1930s and early 1940s. After being released from prison, Hoffmann settled in the Bavarian village of Epfach, not far from the Berghof, where he had spent so much time over the years. Ever the self-publicist, Hoffmann agreed to many interviews which eventually formed the basis for an autobiographical series in 10 segments entitled Hoffmann's Tales, recounting his relationship with Hitler and life in the Nazi inner circle over a quarter of a century. He also produced his own memoirs and published them with the controversial title Hitler Was My Friend in 1955. A year later, many more of his looted artworks were restored to him. He died in Munich on the 16th of December 1957 at the age of 72. While Hoffmann died in 1957, his story continued, owing to the decision of the regional government of Bavaria to return his looted art collection to him in the 1950s. As a consequence of this, the Hoffmann family became a focus of the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, a body set up by the Allies in 1943 while the war was still very much underway, to set about restoring looted cultural property all over Europe to its rightful owners as the continent was liberated. The Monuments Men, as the members of the program eventually became known in the end, numbered over 400 individuals, many of them art critics and historians. As Europe was liberated in 1944 and 1945, they were brought in to assess what was discovered at approximately 1,500 different sites where collections of looted art and cultural artifacts were found. Some of the most substantial were Goering's collection of about 1,000 paintings and sculptures found in Berchtesgaden in southern Germany, when Bavaria was liberated in 1945, and Frank's collection of Renaissance masterpieces in Poland, while 6,500 paintings alone were uncovered in an abandoned salt mine in Austria, a tranche which included Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, and several paintings by the Dutch master Johannes Vermeer. The work of the Monuments Men was the subject of a recent Hollywood movie. The work of the Monument's men continued for many years after the end of the Second World War, and was accompanied by the work of many art agents who sought to recover private possessions that had been stolen wholesale from Jewish people across the continent. Hoffmann's collection became a focus of many investigations, and over the years, some were recovered and restored, either to their former owners or relatives thereof. Hoffmann had also come into possession of several of Hitler's watercolor paintings from the Nazi leader's younger days in Vienna, when he worked as a failed painter. These eventually ended up in the United States Army Center of Military History. In other instances, Henrietta Hoffmann, Heinrich's daughter, resisted recovery efforts, though his grandchildren and great-grandchildren have worked towards returning some of the paintings to relatives of their former owners. A sign of just how lengthy this process can be is that one of Hoffmann's looted paintings, Jan van der Heyden's View of a Dutch Square, painted in the 17th century, was only finally returned in 2019 to the heirs of Gottlieb and Mathilde Kraus, from whom it was stolen in Vienna in 1938, after they fled the Austrian capital to escape persecution following the Anschluss. The Bavarian state had sold the painting back to Henrietta Hoffmann in 1962 for a nominal fee of $75, who sold it a year later to St. Victor's Cathedral in Xanten. The story is a microcosm of how difficult it can be to restore such works to their rightful owners, as they have often passed from those who stole them through multiple hands since, with the current owners in many cases being unaware of how the work came to enter the art market after the war in the first place. Heinrich Hoffmann was one of numerous artistic and cultural figures who were closely associated with the Nazis during the 1920s, 1930s, and the first half of the 1940s. Others included the filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, whose propaganda videos of the Nuremberg rallies in the 1930s produced some of the most infamous portrayals of the Third Reich, and Albert Speer, a celebrated architect who later became the German Minister for Armaments, a position which effectively placed him in charge of the employment of slave labor in Germany between 1942 and 1945. Hoffmann probably lies closer to Speer than Riefenstahl, the latter of whom was more of a fellow traveller than a committed Nazi. Indeed, Hoffmann is unusual in that he was a member of the Nazi movement for a quarter of a century and had a particularly close relationship with Hitler. He began his association with the Führer in 1920, and it lasted down to 1945. During that time, he created some of the most well-known photographic portraits of Hitler, was one of the main individuals involved in classifying degenerate art in the Third Reich, and then benefited enormously both from royalties from his photos and the looting of occupied Europe during the Second World War. Hoffmann could later claim that he tried to protect certain Jewish artists from the regime, and that he was merely a photojournalist rather than a Nazi politician, but there is no denying that he was deeply competent